Connor Leake is a graduate student at Birmingham University. He has written a paper about antinatalism and the right kinds of environmental attitudes. The paper talks about the conflict in values of some form of antinatalism and concerns about environmental preservation. Philanthropic antinatalism can also be called as compassion-based antinatalism. Here, bringing a child into this world causes harm to that child. Therefore, it is not morally permissible to procreate. So, we have a duty to abstain from procreation. On a collective level, this can be said to have extinction as a goal. There are differences between many antinatalists about how such an extinction can be brought about. For example, David Benatar has proposed a phased extinction approach in Better Never to Have Been. So this includes a temporary suspension of our duty to abstain from procreation as long as we are marching towards a common goal of extinction. So even though we might produce future generations, it would be with a plan to end this production in a phased manner. Environmental preservation, on the other hand, assumes that we would keep on producing future generations. It also assumes that we have a duty of providing them, that is the future generations, with a safe environment to live into. Now, there are many other reasons for environmental preservation. For example, you might be concerned about suffering of existing humans and non-human animals due to changing climate. But the main motivator of environmental preservation is still the concern for the future generations. This chart, for example, shows a survey of more than 13,000 US adults who expressed responsibility to protect the environment for future generations as a reason to address global climate change across different demographic groups. On the vertical axis, you see people divided by different parameters like male and female or Democrats and Republicans and so on. They were scored between 1 and 4. Score of 1 means that the concern for future generations is not very important for environmental preservation, whereas a score of 4 shows that it is indeed very important. As you can see, all classes of people have scored well over 3. That is an evidence that for most people who are concerned about environmental preservation, their main concern is the concern for future generations. Also, a lot of green projects, regulations and legislations are long-term projects. If our concern was only for suffering of existing people, then such long-term projects would not have got the support that they have. This points to another curious aspect. If we think of a hypothetical scenario where we are the last generation and there would be no more future generations, it is highly likely that we might abandon the concern for environmental preservation and indulge ourselves in all the resources that we can, like there is no tomorrow, because there will be no tomorrow. That's why environmental preservation becomes a pro-natalist endeavor, where preserving the environment is a means to enabling future generations and providing them with a good life. This is where conflicts between antinatalism and environmental preservation start to appear. First, practicality of extinction. If extinction is an antinatalist goal, then environmental preservation is in completely opposite direction. An individual antinatalist might still have other reasons for his environmental preservation, but on a collective level, he would still be contributing against his own goals of extinction. Second is suffering and harm. Reduction or prevention of suffering is one of the core values of antinatalism. But if we are to contribute to a project which is fundamentally pro-natalist, then we are at least indirectly contributing to creation of future beings who will go on to suffer. Third is a duty of non-procreation. This is also in breach here. An antinatalist may not procreate directly, but if environmental preservation is primarily a pro-natalist project, then he is contributing to it at least indirectly. Imagine a guard who is guarding a notorious prisoner. He makes sure that the prison doors are locked properly but does not care about a loose window. His negligence helps the prisoner to escape through the window. We would call that guard's behavior as a lapse in his duties. Similarly, the antinatalist fails in their duty not by procreating but by supporting an endeavor that undoubtedly contests their values. This contradiction is even more obvious when we look at studies like the one by Edith Brown Weiss talking about our rights and obligation to future generation for the environment. So how can an antinatalist resolve these conflicts? There are 3 possible ways to do this. One is destruction. Destruction might involve actively eliminating habitable areas and exponentially using the planet's resources. This would align with the first value, that is the goal of extinction and therefore prevention of future beings from coming into existence. What about other 2 values? Reduction of suffering and the moral duty to not procreate. Reduction of suffering is a challenge. Immediate destruction will bring about a lot of immediate suffering for existing humans and non-humans. But at the same time, it will also reduce some suffering because now we are free to use as many resources as we want. On a purely negative utilitarian calculation, the suffering of existing beings due to this destruction has to be offset by reduction in suffering because of the free usage of resources and prevention of suffering of potential people who would not come into existence as a result of extinction. But there's a few problems with this calculation. One, it is really hard to make a quantitative arithmetic of suffering this way. And two, even if on some calculation the net suffering is reduced by destruction, it can be realized only if we all agree on antinatalism and then on environmental destruction. And this is unlikely to happen, so destruction only remains a theoretical option, if at all. But pure utilitarian approaches don't consider other points like consent or deontological aspects. This brings us on to the third value, which is the duty to not procreate. Destruction does not directly affect the antinatalist duty to not procreate, but we should remember that this duty comes with a caveat. The duty to not procreate is a moral duty. Most antinatalists agree that it cannot be imposed onto others. Forcible sterilization, for example, is not supported. Destruction, the destruction of the environment and habitable zones, might be seen as an attempt at coercive antinatalism to force others into non-procreation by denying the necessary conditions of sustainable habitation and upbringing. As such, destruction would arguably lead to a violation of the duty of non-procreation by extending it to others unjustifiably. So there are many problems with the destruction approach. Alternatively, we can just have an apathy, like being hands off towards preserving the environment. This is more like not caring much about our impact on the environment, but not going out and actively destroying it either. For example, where destruction on the individual level might be, say, felling the village trees and destroying the local wildlife habitat, apathy is not caring about leaving the lights on, taking liberties with supermarket plastic bags, and going on a Sunday drive if one feels like it. So how does this approach of apathy evaluate on those three values? Just like destruction did, apathy can also lead to extinction, but very slowly. At the very least, there is no conflict between this approach and the goal of extinction. What about suffering and harm? Since in apathy, we are not actively going out to destroy, the immediate suffering to existing beings would be of a lesser degree compared to that in destruction. However, because the path to extinction will be prolonged, it will still cause creation of more beings before the eventual extinction. As for the duty of non-procreation, apathy helps an antinatalist to be more in line with that duty. It enables the antinatalist to at least not contribute to the pronatalist endeavor of environmental preservation. What about the charge of imposing this duty onto others? Is it still coercive antinatalism? Well, unlike destruction, it is not forceful. You're not actively interfering with others' right to procreate. At most, apathy can be called contriving antinatalism. Now, this might actually violate the duty to not manipulate as proposed by Julio Cabrera, but the paper does not consider this. The third way is more of a practical way. We now know the merits and demerits of apathy and destruction as an antinatalist response to environmental preservation. But the merits more or less require a majority for antinatalism, if not majority, at least a significant minority which can have some influence on changing the world. That is not the case today, so it would be better if antinatalists stick to the fundamentals of not causing harm and align themselves with the environmental preservation, even though there are theoretical contradictions between the two. This is what the paper says. Now, there are a few observations that I have on this. One, it is assumed that without environmental preservation, we as humans would necessarily go extinct. The certainty of this is not clear. Imagine that we don't go extinct, but just the quality of lives for a vast majority of people is reduced. Then in that case, both destruction and apathy would not be in alignment of extinctionist antinatalist goal, and on top of that, it would increase the suffering for existing people as well as future generations. Secondly, it is not clear what happens from a sentiocentric antinatalist point of view. Applying these principles to include sentient individuals of other species would change the dynamic drastically. But still, this was very interesting paper and a lot could be expanded further on this topic. Secular Procreation, Metaphysics of Birth in the 21st Century is an article published in the journal Anthropology Today written by Jack Jiang. Traditionally, having children was seen in religious contexts. Almost all religions prescribe having children. There are some hidden antinatalist gems within philosophies of many religions, but they are not for the consumption of ordinary people. This is changing. The article examines how the attitudes towards procreation have shifted from those traditional religious sentiments to more of a secular and ethical evaluations. It mentions various antinatalists from Japan, India, China, the US and the UK, like Lawrence, Pratima, Raphael Samuel, Asage Hozumi, and so on. There's also a depiction of Amanda's artwork of sentient beings trapped in the helical molecule of DNA. There's an interesting wrongful life case called Zepeda versus Zepeda. Wrongful life case, by the way, is a case where a child or someone on behalf of that child sues their parents for giving them birth. So this case, Zapata versus Zapata, was a case in 1963 in Illinois where a son sued his father. The main complaint was his father induced his mother to have a sexual intercourse using a false promise of marrying her and so created this bastard child. What is interesting is the slippery slope that the court used against this case. It said encouragement would extend to all others born into the world under conditions they might regard as adverse. One might seek damages for being born of a certain color, another because of race, one for being born with hereditary diseases, another for inheriting unfortunate family characteristics, one for being born into a large and destitute family, another because a parent has an unsavory reputation. This is interesting because what the court saw as something unimaginable in 1963 now sounds logical in at least some of the scenarios. This is Jack's point. He gives an analogy of claw machines. Claw machines are machines where you try to randomly grab a prize item using a mechanical claw. Sometimes it could be a cheap stuffed toy, at other times it could be an expensive item like a phone. To play the game, you have to pay some money upfront, so essentially it is gambling. These are often rigged against you. Jack likens the odds of acquiring desirable in-game items to the odds of being born to wealthy, socially advantaged parents, an unlikely outcome. This randomized birth is a comparatively new perspective. In the past, people have tried to build some kind of mythology to explain this apparent randomness. For example, Hindus and Buddhists believed in reincarnation, so the situation that one is born into is a result of their deeds in their past lives. But with the rise in secular modernity, these myths fell off. We dare to see the naked truth of chance and randomness. Chance strips meaning from inequality seemingly present at birth and denies that births have any reason for happening. Jack refers to this as Russian roulette. Note that this Russian roulette is slightly different than Benatarian Russian roulette, which was about the randomness of risks of life after one is born. This one is about randomness of being born itself. These random births lead the way to small gods. In traditional religious thinking, it is the power of some kind of divinity, some sky daddy dictating births. Parents are just a means of fulfilling God's plan. But the secular transformation replaces that one big omnipotent God with small gods, that is parents themselves. They are playing God with a child's life. They could easily have used contraception, well, at least where it was easily available, but they chose to gamble with birth. This is even more pronounced with assisted reproductive technologies like IVF, gene selection, or even gene editing. There is a slight contradiction in antenatalists who complain about randomness of birth. Their main complaint is not about being born, but being born in a particular situation, like being born to poor parents, or being born in wars, or being born with heritable diseases. Because if this is so, then as antenatalists, they would have to support selective reproductive technologies for betterment of future children. In fact, Jack says prenatal screening and genetic editing have become so normalized that failing to use them for human betterment implies ignorance or negligence. This is a double-edged sword. You can use these technologies to have a child who will suffer less, but you can also use this for other things, like for propagating one's culture or values, thinking that this sort of propagation can only happen genetically. One prominent example is Malcolm and Simone Collins, who want to have at least 7 children. Simone once said she will continue to have children until her uterus explodes. But Jack mentions a more collective level and a social example of such attitudes. After news of Hamas's attack on Israel in October 2023, many Jewish women felt compelled to have a Jewish child to restore their culture. Meanwhile, Israel doubled down on posthumous sperm retrieval to protect families' right to progeny. Legal scholar Gil Siegel argued that children born under these conditions are seen as living monuments rather than humans. There's also the aspect that cultural values are imposed upon the children. Anxiety about how parents' values shape their children pervades antenatalist thinking. Antenatalists fear that children would be unduly influenced by their parents' values. The child lacks freedom to decide for themselves, even if they never realize it. Conversely, parents often invest in cultivating their own virtues within their children. Even though not mentioned in the article, this argument of postnatal imposition is elaborated in Amanda Sukenick and Mati Hair's book Antenatalism, Extinction and the End of Procreative Self-Corruption. The third aspect is how do we view the potential beings who are not born yet but could be born if certain actions are taken. In religious context, the unborn were taken literally. In Japan, for example, women held memorials for the aborted and stillborn children. Another example is West African Beng babies who were believed to be reincarnated reincarnated and might get homesick to return back to where they came from. We already saw Hindu and Buddhist concepts of past life. There's also a concept of soul or Atma, which is believed to be an independent entity and which changes bodies like we change clothes. Atma, by the way, was also the name of Schopenhauer's dog. Secularized antinatalism also has some relations to the unborn. Secularism allows room for relations with the non-existent. Just as the living owe something to the departed, the unborn are becoming part of the moral universe. Rather than dismissing these entities, secularism requires ethical relations to be formed through proper reasoning, shaping how we imagine and relate to them. John Rawls's Veil of Ignorance is a good example of this. I won't go into too much of details of that experiment, but the idea is to question whether we would like to be born without knowing beforehand where and which social class we would end up in. If we structure our society such that these parameters won't matter anymore, then we have solved at least some part of the consent argument. This consent argument, according to Jack, shapes how antinatalists imagine their children. Now, I don't agree with this last statement because potential children are central to other antinatalist arguments as well, like Bennett's asymmetry or the risk argument, etc. Even Julio Cabrera's opposition to abortion has an element of potentiality attached to the fetus. In summary, there are three aspects evaluated here against the transition from religious pronatalist attitudes to secular antinatal attitudes. Random birth instead of some mythological justifications for randomness of birth, parents playing gods instead of a divine god, and a reasoned perspective to look at the potentiality of the unborn instead of thinking of them as literal entities. Natal Conference will be taking place on 28th and 29th of March 2025. It is not a free event. The tickets are again $1,000. It is again in Austin, Texas. The list of speakers is not very different than what it was the last time. It is the same mix of pronatalists with different shades of usually conservative values. The schedule is also not very different. 28th March is just dinner and gathering, and on 29th, which is Saturday, there is again closed door breakout sessions. I really don't understand this closed door thing. I mean, when you want to spread the message of having more children in a society which already has a pronatalist bias, at least in the psychology of individuals, why have closed door sessions? Anyway, after that, there'll be sessions of speakers for rest of the day before dinner again. As of now, on their website, it shows 14 people are going. So if you have $1,000 to spare, I would suggest you rather donate them to a good charity. On to some notable videos. This week, Amanda was interviewed on a channel called Captainese about antinatalism. I must say the host, who was not an antinatalist, was just as brilliant as Amanda. She asked some really good questions. They discussed the definition of antinatalism, so many shades of antinatalism, the topic of euthanasia, extinction, Pollyannism, pro-mortalism, and so on. So it was a very entertaining hour-long discussion. Talking of Amanda, 98th episode of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast was released. It was an interview of Georgie and Gabriel, who are the authors of an antinatalism article in Portuguese. The translated title is The March of the Unborn Spectres, Antinatalism, Hauntology, and Historical Futures. Hauntology is the idea that something from the past comes back, usually as a ghost or spectre. So the paper is investigating how the ideas around end of times from history have come back to haunt us in form of contemporary antinatalism. The paper also evaluates other reproductive pessimisms and relations between philosophical antinatalism and antinatalism activism. The podcast touches on a lot of these topics, along with some detours into some aspects about the authors themselves and how they ended up writing and publishing this article despite so many hurdles. Overall, a great episode, and now we are just too short of a century of episodes of Exploring Antinatalism podcast. There was also a video about Emile Chiron's book, The Trouble with Being Born. Now, the book itself is a collection of aphorisms illustrating why being born is a disaster, what causes our suffering, and what we could do to cope. The whole video is a nice little retreat into this pessimistic world. Lawrence made a new Antinatalism Around the World episode. This time it was Luca from Serbia. They talk about Bogomils, who were an antinatalistic sect between 10th and 15th century. Other than that, Luca spoke about many aspects of antinatalism with the background of Balkan history, religion, and politics.